Brilliant. Thank you, Mariella. And so as you have just heard, this session is going to be recorded, and we're recording it so that we can send it to your universities so that you can use it if you wish to reference and use it just as a resource, basically to refer back to at your leisure. So welcome and thank you for your time today. This session is about your rights to adjustments, focusing really on the recruitment process for the most part. I'm Cindy McAllister. I'm head of compliance with employability, and I'm joined today by my colleague Mariella, who is our universities coordinator. So just to give you a tiny bit of information about how you might want to kind of use your contacts with us today. So we have a campus ambassador program, which Mariella runs, and so I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But if you are interested in that, please reach out to her, and she will put her details in the chat. As I said, I'm head of compliance, so I am a solicitor. And so I deal a lot with the kind of rights sides of our organisation. And so if you ever have any questions going forward about that, you'll either be dealing with one of our adjustments team because they can answer many of the questions, or if you prefer to speak to me, if it's something more complex, then you can always email me directly. So a little bit about us, first of all. So employability, to who we are and how we can help. Well, we are a not-for-profit organisation. We've been around since 2006. So that is almost 20 years of supporting talented, disabled and neurodivergent individuals, graduates into recruitment, and also supporting you with internships. We do also work with employer organisations, very large organisations to some slightly smaller organisations, but global names, examples such as Amazon, Google, Meta, banks, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and just a range of other organisations. And then more recently, smaller, more local organisations, employers. So we're kind of broadening the field. We work with them to try to educate them, to ensure that they're as inclusive as possible in their processes and that they really understand what disability is about, and how to kind of make their processes and their cultures inclusive and cultures of belonging, and to screen in as opposed to screening out for disabled talent. It's become easier in the last few years, the last handful of years, I'd say, because when we started this business, it was quite an unknown area. And now, you know, diversity and inclusion is much more on the agenda generally, and disability as a part of that has kind of been raised in people's awareness. So our job has become slightly easier, happily, and we're very proud to do that. We also support, and this was our kind of original mission when we started, was to support individual students and graduates, university students and graduates, into the workplace. So to make sure that kind of transition between they were getting some support at university, but our founder noticed that there was a gap in the market, so to speak, where that support wasn't necessarily being extended to help people get into the workplace. So supporting very much on an individual basis, whether it's for an internship, whether it's for a spring week, whether it's for a graduate program, really based on a kind of confidential conversation about what you need and how you might be impacted by a particular recruitment process, let's say, or particular workplace, and then kind of negotiating, advocating on your behalf and negotiating with potential employers to ensure that you get the adjustments that you need. That was kind of what we kicked off doing, and we still very much do it. And you can see there that we are very proud to say that we have now passed the 20,000 mark in terms of the students and graduates we have supported into employment. And a little bit of our mantra here. So we are entirely unapologetic in the drive for a level playing field. That's kind of what drives everything we do. So I just mentioned a little bit about what we do, but just to dig down into a little bit more detail. So we run schemes, essentially programs with our partners, with our employer partners. So that might be a graduate scheme, it might be an internship scheme, and all of those are available on our website. You can go and take a look. They cover a range of different sectors. But in those partnerships, our partners will, it's usually the same scheme that anybody else would apply to, that a non-disabled or non-neurodivergent applicant would apply to. But if you are disabled or have a neurodivergence, then you apply via us and we support you through that process, make sure that we're kind of, putting the best possible spin on things where you might have some profile differences as a result of your condition. Then we will explain them or ask them to be disregarded, or sometimes help you to think about how you might present that in a very positive way. And so very interesting programs. Go and take a look if you have the time, if you're interested. There are also, as you see, there's scholarship programs. They tend to be tech programs, but that's free money for those of you who are interested. And what's interesting about those schemes, I suppose, in particular, is that those employers are willing to put money where their mouth is to kind of really try to kind of proactively recruit disabled and neurodivergent talent. So they really want it. They want it enough to be able to put some money to it. So if you do make it through, you're really kind of, they're looking for you. Yeah. So a lot of the things that we're going to discuss today are much less of an issue when you're talking to our employer partners. So we also provide you with one-to-one adjustments advice. That's what I'm saying. So all you need to do to get access to that is to register with us. And when you register with us, just let us know that you have registered with us, and somebody will be in touch with you within 1 or 2 days to find out what we can do to support you and help you. And that is all completely free for you because we partner with your universities. So that comes down to our university partnerships. And so, you get the full access to all of our services because of that partnership. So they're really, really wonderful. And so to just remind you again, just so that we can really ensure that we keep these partnerships going forward, if you can just pop into the feedback form which university you came from, that allows us to continue to work with your universities because they know that we are reaching their students. So we also run skills enhancement programs throughout the year. We have specialist websites, webinars and resources which we can provide to you. And then anything that you need to know, just reach out to us. We're always ready to provide you with kind of bespoke advice on anything. And then finally, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, we have our employability campus ambassadors. So this is essentially unpaid role. It's a voluntary role, essentially, which my colleague Mariella, who is here on this session, runs. That's really about raising awareness on your campus about the support that we give, so that as many students as possible can have access to that as soon as possible. However, the way in which you do that is entirely up to you. We'd love to hear all of your brilliant ideas, and kind of really you can give as much time to that or as little time to that as you want. And it can go on your CV as work experience, and we invite you to join our LinkedIn page. So it's all good stuff in terms of your work experience and just really being able to kind of, I suppose, brainstorm a bit and kind of put your ideas into a kind of business context that helps us and that helps you. So if you are interested in that, as I say, please do reach out to Mariella. We'd be absolutely thrilled to have you on board. So moving on to the kind of main body now of today's presentation. So here are the things. So we're going to have a little look at what constitutes a disability, very briefly, what an employer's duty is, what is meant by reasonable in the context of adjustments, some common misconceptions around asking for adjustments. And then we're going to look at what sorts of adjustments are available during the recruitment process, then workplace adjustments, and then how you can go about accessing our services, which I've obviously already talked very briefly about. So in terms of the definition of disability, I think it's really important that we just kind of take stock for, a few seconds, a few minutes to think about what this is. Because some people aren't sure whether they fall within this, and they're not sure whether they need to prove it or kind of what the boundaries are. So the definition of disability in the UK is set down in the Equality Act of 2010. And it says that a disability is a physical or mental impairment which has a substantial long-term adverse effect on a person's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. And the categories, as you can see, are here. So this covers sensory impairments, so visual and auditory impairments, any physical disabilities, which can also include disfigurement, any sort of neurodivergence, speech or language impairments, mental health conditions, and long-term health conditions. Now, how do these two things fit together? Well, substantial, let's have a little look at that word substantial. Substantial doesn't really mean substantial in the sense that we would understand it. What it means is more than minor or trivial. So it's a very low bar. Long term means a year. So whatever the impact, whatever the effect of your condition is, those effects either do or are likely to last at least 1 year. And then, as you can see there, and it's quite key because this is a bit different to what you often find in legislation in other countries. It's not an ability to carry out your job or the potential job, it's normal day-to-day activities. And again, this has been interpreted incredibly broadly. So the word substantial, I wouldn't worry about it too much. Normal activities, I wouldn't worry about them too much. So globally, if you have a neurodivergence, you're almost certainly going to fall into this category. I would say certainly, actually. I've never heard of a case where that isn't true. For long-term health conditions, there are a few kind of tweaks, which is that for certain conditions, such as cancer, HIV, multiple sclerosis, you do not have to fulfill the 1 year criteria. So from the point of diagnosis, you're considered disabled, and irrespective of whether you recover, that continues forever. Okay, so even if you are, you've survived cancer and there are no signs and you're in remission and that has been going for 10 years, you remain disabled according to the Equality Act with the privileges and the benefits that provides you with. So mental health, I suppose, is worth touching upon just very, very briefly in terms of it's not about the severity of the diagnosis. So and actually this is true for everything, right? But this actually has an impact more on mental health. It's not about what the diagnosis is. So you could have stress or you could have schizophrenia, and both of those two things can be disabilities as long as they fulfill the other criteria. So they have to be they have to last for more than a year or be likely to last for more than a year. So something circumstantial happens in your life and you have kind of short-term depression, which will happen to most of us at some point, that won't constitute a disability unless it triggers something that lasts a bit longer. So it's really that 1 year that you need to focus on. So moving on from that, what does all of this mean? So if you have a disability, according to the Equality Act, and I'm very conscious that that's a word that not everybody, is that comfortable applying to themselves. But, for the purposes of this, we're talking about the benefits from a legal perspective. So we're talking about, what the adjustments you can have, the protections you can have. So, even if you're not comfortable with it from a legal perspective, kind of set that aside if you can. So the employer's duty, so under Section 20 of the Equality Act, so an employer has a duty to provide reasonable adjustments which reduce, remove, or prevent any obstacles that a disabled person will experience compared to a non-disabled person. So this only applies, it's discrimination, it's disability discrimination if they fail to do this. However, this duty only applies if they are aware of the disability or should be aware of the disability. Now, if you're at work, so if you get a job and your behavior indicates to them that they should be asking some questions around whether you have a disability or not, then they should be asking some questions. And that's a duty on them to act proactively, to kind of ask the questions to establish whether you have a disability and what that might be, in order that they can provide you with adjustments. In recruitment, it's obviously a bit more difficult. They don't know you, they're not seeing you in the office on a kind of daily basis. So there it really falls to you to ask for adjustments. So the duty to understand applies to both, but basically in a workplace, the employer has to ask those questions I'm talking about. So whether you tell them you have a disability or whether they question whether you might, in either case, they have a duty to ask whichever questions need to be asked in order to try to understand what that duty is, what that disability is, and how it might impact you, in order to understand the adjustments you might need. So the duty to understand actually also extends to recruitment, but obviously in that context, really you're going to be telling them what you need. And the reason you're going to be telling them what you need is because they're not allowed, unlike the workplace, they're not allowed to ask questions about your disability itself. So whilst that duty to understand exists kind of both within recruitment and within the workplace, how that will manifest and how we're going to get them to understand is like very, very different. Very importantly, there's no kind of list of what can and cannot be a reasonable adjustment. Employers are required to assess on the basis of an individual's needs, which are assessed on the basis of the specific effect on that individual. So it has to be very, very personalized. So this is all what they have to do. And they have to think creatively and proactively about what you may need as an individual, including putting together a kind of holistic package, including coming up with things that they may never have imagined before, if that will reduce, remove, or prevent the obstacles so that you get a level playing field. And as I said, any failure to produce that under Section 21, a failure to provide you with those adjustments is disability discrimination. So we talk about reasonable adjustments, and it's almost become a sort of term in itself, I suppose, reasonable adjustments. But I think it's very important to focus on what we mean by reasonable. Part of that is just so that you understand it, but another part of that is because I think there can be a concern as a result of this terminology, which is, oh, I don't think what I'm asking for sounds reasonable, or they might think I'm unreasonable for asking for this. So I think it's important to kind of understand that, you know, it's not reasonable in a kind of layman's terms, and you shouldn't worry about it. You shouldn't worry about whether the thing is reasonable or not. You need to ask for whatever it is you need, and then they can worry, the employer can worry about whether that is legally reasonable. But from a kind of, information basis, what we mean by that is that it is objectively reasonable. So there is a test, there is a test of objective reasonableness, which is based on the facts and circumstances of any specific organisation and the needs of any particular individual. Ultimately, this will always be for an employment tribunal to decide. So if there's any kind of disagreement between yourselves and an employer, it's always, one opinion versus the other, and only the employment tribunal can actually make a definitive decision about that. But employers are required to apply the test and try to essentially come up with the conclusion that they think an employment tribunal would come up with. And so the test in question, the relevant factors that need to be taken into account are how effective any particular adjustment will be in avoiding the specific disadvantage experienced by that particular individual in those particular circumstances, how practical the adjustment is, the cost of the adjustment, the resources available to that particular organisation. So a bigger organisation would be expected to have more money and more resources than a smaller one, and the availability of any financial support, so access to work, for example. As I said, the crucial thing is, as a disabled or neurodivergent applicant or eventually employee, so it's good, I think, for you to know these are the elements that need to be taken into account, but you should not be concerned by this. You should be coming at this from the perspective of what is it that I need, and then you ask for what you need, and then the burden is on the employer to show that what you asked for is not reasonable. And then they run the risk, if they get that wrong, of subjecting themselves to a fine for discrimination. So really very important, ask positively, confidently for what it is you need. We can help you understand that. We can ask on your behalf, but try not to worry too much about what is or what is not reasonable, and just like figure out what it is that's needed. In the vast majority of cases, what you ask for will be reasonable. Just one final point on this, only work-related changes are adjustments. Anything that falls outside of that, that's outside of your way of working, that won't fall within the legislation, so they won't be required to provide you with that. So before I move on to the next set of slides around misconceptions, Mariella, are there any questions in the chat?
I think it's just one, just asking how you can register.
How what, sorry?
How they can register. I'll just put our website.
Brilliant, thank you, thank you. So let's have a look at some of the misconceptions that typically surround the adjustment process in recruitment. These are very common. So we've put together these most common misconceptions that we've seen over the years, that are the questions that we often find ourselves being asked. So the first one is the disclosure misconception, which is in order to get adjustments, I have to disclose my disability. I have to talk about my condition. As I said, it's a misconception, so you absolutely do not have to. Disclosure, still bandied around, still incredibly common, is in fact a hangover from, as a term, in terms of terminology, it's a hangover from the previous legislation. And their disclosure of your disability, yes, that was a thing. It hasn't been since 2010, and it never ceases to amaze me. 2010 isn't that recent now, so we've had this legislation for a good long while, and yet these misconceptions continue. So the Equality Act has this wonderful thing within it, which is called Section 60, and Section 60 of the Equality Act says that employers are not entitled to ask you any health or disability related questions until they've made you a job offer. Why? Well, that's because once they've made you a job offer, the kind of burden shifts. It's much easier for you at that point, if there is any discrimination around disability or asking for adjustments, for you to prove that. If they make you a job offer, you ask for a certain adjustment and they withdraw that job offer, that is pretty easy stuff to prove. In the recruitment process, that isn't necessarily the case, because the law says that in order to kind of win a disability discrimination case on the basis of adjustments, you need to show you didn't get the job because of it. Very, very tricky to prove, but often also, who's really going to bother? Like, most people aren't going to have the means or the time or the will, or, they might feel anxious around doing that. And that's particularly true for students, obviously, who have, less access to kind of legal support. So bearing all of that in mind, in its wisdom, Parliament added this extra thing, Section 60, so that to try to kind of balance the burden a little bit, to kind of try and balance the power between the two parties. So they're not allowed to ask you any questions about health and disability, and the reasoning being that, if they do and you tell them something that they don't like, they might discriminate against you. So they can't do that. However, obviously you need to be able to ask about adjustments that you need. So there are some exceptions carved out to this Section 60 ban on asking health related questions. One of them is that they can ask you if you need adjustments during the recruitment process. So you tell them what adjustments you need. What they can't then do is ask you any further questions about your health. So they can't kind of go, oh, why do you need those? And what is it, and kind of like dig down. So if they do, you're within your rights to say, section 60, I'd rather not answer. We can have that conversation on your part. But anyway, so you don't have to go into any detail at all about your disability. You just need to ask for the adjustments that you need. You don't even need to go into the category of disabilities. You don't need to say, oh, I've got a mental health issue, I'm neurodivergent, sometimes it will be obvious, and you can do that if you wish, but you're not required to. So you need to be talking really focused on telling them about the adjustments that you need, rather than the nature of their disability. As I say, they can't ask. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't. So what we will often see happening is, particularly in respect of hidden disabilities, particularly in respect of neurodivergence, they will ask for an educational psychologist report. Now, they're not really supposed to be doing this in recruitment. And again, you may be perfectly comfortable to provide something that says that in education you got 25% extra time, or you may not. And, a lot of the information in an educational psychologist report is, it's quite detailed. So it's more than they would necessarily need to provide a small adjustment to the recruitment process. I mean, we're not talking about checking a competency here. We're talking about the process by which they check that competency. So that information is disproportionate, and you don't have to hand it over. You don't have to hand over all these details. But some employers don't know that, and we're very happy to explain that on your behalf if you don't want to. The other point about asking for these educational psychologist reports is, let me go on to the second slide because this is dealt with more in the second slide. The important point about those reports is also that the adjustments that you may have got in education, and educational psychologist reports are written for education, are not necessarily going to have any bearing whatsoever on what you need for the recruitment process or any one particular stage of the recruitment process. So what really needs to be happening is, each stage of the recruitment process assessed on a kind of individual's needs, ask for the adjustments based on that. So you can say no, as I said, and sometimes talking about GDPR will also make that a little bit more palatable for them, because there tends to be a higher level of awareness around UK GDPR than around the Equality Act in terms of asking for this kind of information. And so, as I said, if you receive pushback, if you're not comfortable to provide these reports, and if you receive pushback, then we can talk to them on your behalf. But again, there are two things within the reports. Proving that you have some kind of condition is one, but then, the tendency to fall back on, oh, and you were given this in education, so that's what we're going to give you in recruitment, which is entirely not the law. That's the tendency, and that's what needs to be avoided. So disclosure misconception number 3, I need to disclose my condition so that the employer will know what I need. So if we just take a step back and think about this for a minute, right? There really is no reason to suppose that you tell an employer that you have dyslexia, a hearing impairment, autism, depression, that they would know. Okay, so we're talking about a range of anything that can be a disability. We're talking about the fact that each individual is impacted completely differently, or potentially so. And we're talking about an employer organisation that is not a specialist kind of medical organisation. So the chances of them actually being in a position to have that expertise for every single individual is, I would say it's vanishingly small. So you, but particularly you with our experts speaking to you who really do know this, so this is literally what they've been doing day in, day out for decades, are in a better position to tell them what you need, right? So given that, there really is no need to be telling an employer all this information about yourself, because actually, what can they do with it? So unless they're assuming that because they've seen, the same condition, and therefore that person with that condition needs the same as this person with this condition, which is entirely wrong and untrue from a medical perspective and a legal perspective, then they don't need to be in possession of this information. But again, there's often a lack of understanding of that amongst employers who may, with the best will, think that if they have that information, then they can help you to get the adjustment you need, but they're not necessarily right. So again, you tell them what it is you need. Yeah, and that can be very, very variable. But you know, it's whatever it is you need to get yourself through an interview, assessment center, completing online psychometric tests, whatever. And as I said, we can help and support you with that, not only in terms of providing you with the information when we understand and have this personal, very kind of specific conversation with you about how you're impacted. Yeah, our team, our adjustments team, will also look at the specifics of any particular recruitment process that you're about to go through, and including looking at the specific tests, the interview formats, and so on, and think, okay, how really can we help you here? What might be difficult for you here? And then they can ask the employer to put that in place for you. Yes, another adjustment misconception. It is better not to ask for adjustments to avoid discrimination. The very clear message that we send is that you must ask for the adjustments that you need, because you have a much better chance of success with those adjustments in place. And, you know, yes, I understand the fear of discrimination, yeah, but others who need those adjustments will be asking for them. So if you don't, you're almost certainly going to be at a disadvantage. And that means that in a way you're kind of discriminating against yourself by not requesting and therefore receiving the adjustments that you need to succeed. And it's just a reality that if you need the adjustment and don't ask for it, you're less likely to succeed. So yes, ask for what you need, give yourself the best chance, you know, of a level playing field. It is your right. Employers expect to have to provide this these days. Now, it would be naive to say that you don't risk being discriminated against. Of course, you know, there is always that risk. Human beings are human beings, and they engage in discriminatory practices, whether they do that consciously or subconsciously. But it is illegal. There is massively increased knowledge around adjustments now compared to even, say, 10 years ago. It is illegal. Most reputable firms and companies aren't going to risk that. The approach has changed, you know, very greatly, but they just really don't want the reputational and financial risk involved in not providing you with adjustments. So there's the risk element, but then there's also something which is really positive, which is that we're seeing so many employers now who are genuinely keen to be recruiting disabled and neurodivergent talent, because they know that diverse teams make much better decisions. And all the statistics bear that out. So, you know, there's an actual thirst for this. So you can almost see it as a positive in a certain sense. So there we have. I'm just going to let this person in. So you ask positively, confidently, and unapologetically. That's our little chap there with his t-shirt on. So with that mantra in mind, Mariella, are there any questions before I move on to the next section, which is the categories of adjustments, the sorts of adjustments you can get?
Yeah, we've got a few. So a gap on a CV due to health reasons. I just write had health problems. There's no need for proof afterwards. I don't want future employers to know anything, but have a gap of 1 year on my CV. What should I do?
Yeah, that's right. So they can't ask. They mustn't ask. And yeah, you should be putting something. It was health related. In terms of the specific wording you want to use around that, speak to our adjustment team. They're amazing. Yeah, so they will tell you how best to write that, to spin it. But yes, absolutely, you're right. They can't ask any follow-up questions around that unless and until they've made you a job offer, and then they can't withdraw the job offer. But a gap on your CV is better explained than not explained. And in vague terms, referencing health so that they can't push it any further. That's right.
And then Can an employer refuse to engage with another party, such as yourselves, if you ask for reasonable adjustments? If their attitude is that it wouldn't be too much hassle, I know it would be too much hassle, or that it would complicate things. What is the
Well,
best? Oh, yeah, sorry. That's a different
well, they can't take, I mean, what people can and can't do legally, and what they do, as we all know, isn't always the same thing, right? But let's just assume that they're not going to kind of gratuitously break the law. Assuming they're not going to gratuitously break the law, they are going to engage with you about the adjustments that you may need. Then the question is, if you say, I'd like you to speak to my representative, are they going to say, oh no, that's too much of a hassle, I need to speak directly to the candidate? Well, that just doesn't really run legally anyway. You can have anybody you like represent you. And quite apart from anything else, that in and of itself is an adjustment. So you can just avoid any problem by saying, as a reasonable adjustment, I would like you to speak to employability, who is my representative. You shouldn't have to do that. I don't think there's ever been a situation in which somebody has refused to engage with us. It looks terribly bad. And for the most part, you know, I mean, I think they'd be very worried about the reputational risk. But anyway, having said that, you know, our team are really lovely. So the employers tend to quite like dealing with them, and they tend to learn a lot. And so whilst this looks, the way I'm presenting it to you, because I'm talking about your rights, this looks quite sort of, I suppose, combative. And it can be, I won't lie. There have been a few examples where you get, you know, really kind of rigid organization who thinks they know right, and and we have to kind of, you know, really push. But I mean, a handful of cases I've ever come across that. For the most part, it's very, very different to that. For the most part, they're really happy to have that conversation, to learn something, to be speaking to our, you know, very nice and jolly team who are explaining to them what this candidate needs, and, you know, taking some of the burden off them from trying to understand it, and reassuring them that as long as they do this, you know, they're meeting their legal requirements, and, you know, they can help going forward should this person be successful. So that is the general kind of vibe, I think. Now, if you're talking about somebody who just point blank refuses to engage generally, you know, at that point, you need to, as I say, you need to push back. You need to be like, you're not allowed to do this, you're breaking the law. And we will do that too on your behalf if you need. But I mean, I wouldn't worry about it. The reality isn't how it plays out in the vast, vast majority of cases. It's all really straightforward and very, very friendly. And I mean, they tend to be very, very open. They tend to be very open. Even organizations that are asking for medical information when they shouldn't be, when we reach out to them and explain to them they're not allowed to do that, it tends to be, oh, it's a surprise. They weren't doing it because they're trying to be difficult. That's what they thought they had to do, because that's what they had to do under the previous legislation, or they don't know the legislation, or, you know, whatever, or they've been badly advised. So there tends not to be any particular pushback around that. What we do sometimes hear is that, so they might say to us, well, have you checked that this person has a diagnosis? And the answer is no, we don't check whether you're diagnosed or not. So if you don't yet have a diagnosis, that's fine. But, you know, so this kind of idea of a diagnosis, you know, and again, we can kind of talk them through that and explain to them that this is not competency standards that we're changing. This is just the method on which you test that. So, you know, it needs to be very light touch. You know, the what they have to do to get that information for you, it has to be entirely proportionate to what we're asking them to change, which is just the method of testing. We're not asking them to change the content. We're not asking for any sort of free pass. We're just asking for them to think a little bit differently about how they assess you. So once you've made that point, and then once you've kind of pointed out section 60, that tends to work. And most adjustments don't cost anything. So, you know, I think these kind of fears that employers have, once they see that they're, you know, not particularly realistic in a particular case, and once it's presented in, you know, a palatable way, then there tends not to be any problem. So do speak to our adjustments team, and they, you know, they are really in control of this, and they will be able to speak to an employer on your behalf in a way that isn't detrimental to you in the vast majority of cases. Is there anything else, Mariella?
Yeah, and then they just added how to approach this with a small employer, but I think you
How
sort of, sorry?
how to approach?
Yeah, with a small employer.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit more ad hoc, obviously. So, again, we can do that. But, you know, standardly, it would just be something quite informal. Make sure you do it before entering any kind of assessment realm of any sort. Just let them know I may need reasonable adjustments for the process. I'm going to have an organization that represents me get in touch with you, and here's that or you can ask yourself, again, just informally by email, is there somebody I can speak to about this, that sort of thing. Okay, so I'm just going to move on to the actual adjustments if there's nothing else, Mariella.
Got one more.
Okay.
It was just carrying on from that one about the gaps in CV.
Yeah.
Would I have to send documentary proof afterwards for the health problems after the job offer?
Only if you want adjustments in the workplace, which you probably would, right? So if you need adjustments for recruitment, we can assume you would, in order to thrive and sustain and manage to be in the workplace, then you should be asking for the adjustments you need, definitely. And at that point, yes. Right. So what you don't need to do, just to be clear, you don't need to prove after the event that you had a condition that justified you asking for recruitment adjustments, right? So you're not required to kind of, you know, post hoc prove that point. Yeah. But what they can ask you for, and what they should be asking you for, is once they've made you an offer, they should be asking you, if you have a disability, what that disability, certainly if you've asked during the recruitment process, they know you have a disability, right? So at that point, they can ask for any kind of medical records to try to understand, and they have to, because that's their duty. It's what I was talking about before, the kind of section 20. To ask for all the questions they can, so that they can understand as fully as possible what you need in the workplace. You do not have to, however, provide anything. Right. So if you decide, I'm not comfortable with this, and that happens, you know, we do see that typically, I don't know, mental health condition or a neurodivergent condition in a kind of very pressurized environment where, you know, somebody might perceive that's going to be perceived as weakness, you know, I'm not comfortable sharing that, then they may not ask for, you may not wish to ask for adjustments. We would say you should, but, you know, as I said, that's up to you. But but they are entitled to ask for the information. They can't force you to. So you just say no, GDPR, right? But you may not then get the adjustments that you need. And they can ask, and they're allowed to ask. What they're not allowed to do is like keep pressurizing you. But equally, there's case law that says that if you don't produce the information, or you don't tell them, then, you know, their duty ends there, essentially, right? They can't provide you with things if they don't know what they're supposed to provide you with. But again, we can help with that. So we can help with that process, and we can kind of explain that to you in more detail, or kind of, you know, work with you through that to try and kind of find a way of making that manageable. Oh, and I suppose one more point on that. Just because you haven't asked for adjustments during the recruitment process does not mean you can't ask for them once you've been made an offer. And they're not allowed to discriminate against you. They're not allowed to kind of say, well, you misled us. You didn't mention your disability. You know, there's case law on that too. So they're not even allowed to say those words, right? Let alone act upon it. Okay, so just moving on to adjustments during recruitment then. So a couple of key pieces. So during recruitment, you only need to ask for recruitment adjustments, not workplace adjustments. Yeah. And the reason for that is it's to give you the greatest chance of success. What do I mean by that? So I mean that, you know, there's that risk of discrimination. If somebody in an interview context says, well, what do you think you might need to do the job itself? And, you know, they're questioning, is this going to be a burden on us, right? This is going to be expensive if they're actually hired. So they're actually banned. Employers are banned from asking that particular question. It's part of the Section 60 prohibition. They're not actually allowed to ask you about workplace adjustments until they've made a job offer. So they can only ask you about adjustments you need during the recruitment process, and you should only be telling them about the adjustments you need for that particular bit of the recruitment process. Now, they will often ask what you need for the entire process, but you can say, well, for this bit, I need this. You don't need to be telling them upfront what you might need for an interview, which is 4 stages later. Yeah, it's just too much information. It's your private information. You may never get there. There's always a slight risk of discrimination. Just tell them what you need to know for each stage. And you don't really know what the thing looks like either until you kind of get close to it. So we take it one thing at a time. Now, if you want to, you can. But, our strong advice would be one step at a time, each stage of the recruitment process at a time. And then, as I said, workplace adjustments only discuss once you've been made a job offer. Yeah. Here are the different categories, right? So there are categories for adjustments during recruitment process. This is not an exhaustive list, and there is no exhaustive list. It's kind of what I've been saying before. An employer is required to find the adjustment or the package of adjustments for you that suits you best, bearing in mind how your disability or neurodivergence impacts you. So these are just broad examples. So something that people often forget about, so this is quite key to bring this one up, is adapted screening. So it may be, for example, that because of your disability, your profile doesn't quite meet the required conditions, or it looks a little bit different. It's the mention that you said somebody about the CV, there being a gap on your CV. So it may be that it's taken you longer than normal to complete your degree, or there is some inconsistency in your grades. It may be that your school grades were impacted because you weren't diagnosed, say, with a neurodivergence before a certain point, and once you were, your grades improved. It may be that you don't have all that much work experience because of disability. And whenever these things are the result of disability, we can ask an employer to take them into account, as an adjustment. So basically adjust your screening criteria, adjust your expectations, because this is related to disability. So they won't always do it, but they should. But certainly you're well within your rights to ask. It does work. It works. And again, it's often quite an awkward conversation, this one. So I understand this really might be one that you would you might wish to talk to us about how best to approach that. And as I said, people often don't even know that this exists as an idea. But it's there and you can do it. So if that impacts you potentially, please speak to one of our adjustment team. Accessible instructions. So it may be that you need something provided in kind of clearer, precise bullet form instructions. The format of the interview. So, behavioral kind of questions could be provided in, a different way. Adapting interviews, this can mean all sorts of things. I mean, it's just a bit of how long is a piece of string. So you can request to have your camera switched off, for example, to have an interview virtually or by telephone or in person, as opposed to one of those other 3. You can ask to have interview questions in advance. Now, it won't be days and days in advance. It'll be a little bit in advance, usually if you have a processing issue. That could also apply for anxiety as well. So, a range of different things. You might be able to ask for more time to process the questions without being given them in advance. So like pause for thinking time, additional thinking time, extra time for interviews in and of itself, just as you would for, an exam. You can ask to have questions broken down, long questions, for example, broken down into shorter parts. You can ask to have questions read out as opposed to just provided in a written format. So there are a whole range of things, and I think that's the point I want to really make. The other important thing in terms of interviews, I think, is so things like behavioral adjustments, right? Adjustments, we call them adjustments of perception. So we will ask the interviewer to adjust their perception of what they're seeing, to set aside their assumptions that certain behaviors mean certain things. What do I mean by that? So for example, somebody who has autism or a mental health condition, depression, may find it difficult making eye contact. That can also be true of somebody who is sight impaired in a way that isn't necessarily obvious. And it may not occur to the interviewer that it's one of these things, that it's not disinterest. Yeah. Similarly, something like an appearance of low energy could be taken to mean disinterest. But if it's related to disability, it is not. So that would be their misunderstanding, their misinterpretation of what they think are social signs and behaviours. So if we know that that can impact you in that way, then what we do is we tell the interviewer beforehand, do not hold these behaviours against this candidate because they are related to disability. Yeah, that can be other things. So I have ADHD. So I have a tendency to impulsively interrupt. And in an interview context, it would be don't hold that against her. But any kind of behavioural differences at all can be asked if they're related to disability, not to be held against you. So support worker, as you can see, you can take a support worker with you into an interview. These are all possibilities. We've requested support animals to be present. So that's all entirely possible. So what I have, assessment centres. Let's have a little think about assessment centres. We could have things like breaks throughout the day, sitting in a separate room for an assessment. You can have the format change, so black text on cream background. For some people with dyslexia, that's easier. For example, there are many variations, whatever it is, whatever your disability is, there's whatever's applicable to you. Again, clear and unambiguous instructions, including in an assessment centre context. Many different kind of permutations of what can be asked for. Again, I've mentioned already adapting attitude. So I think we've touched on that already. No point to going over that again. And then, so for physical disabilities, so changes to the environment, changes to where an interview might take place. It might be easier to have a virtual interview, or have an interview at a different time that makes it easier to travel. Ground floor as opposed to a higher floor, or to have an assistant with you, for example. Yes, the whole range depends. The other thing that you might not have thought of is in terms of things like schedule interviews. So we will sometimes say this person may need to change the timing at the last moment due to disability. So we would expect you not to hold that against them and provide them with another time, which usually won't work if it's not disability related. You've kind of got one shot, but if it's disability related, that too can be an adjustment. So workplace adjustments, well, they're often really quite similar to recruitment adjustments. So the categories will tend to be the same, as you'll see in a moment. How you go about getting them, usually there will be a designated person. In smaller organizations, that can be an adjustment individual. In bigger organizations, in smaller organizations, it will often be HR, or it may be that it's your manager. And smaller organizations, they may not have a process in place around that necessarily, so that you may have to kind of feel your way through it and see who you're more comfortable speaking with. Managers can be very various. So some of them will be very understanding, knowledgeable, willing and wanting to help, and others less so, in which case HR will tend to be the place to go. Again, really, we're talking about a workplace. So it's incredibly important once you make it into the workplace that you get the adjustments you need in order that you can thrive. So actually what happens quite a lot in reality is people make it through the recruitment process, disabled individuals make it through the recruitment process, but then the work environment is such, and the concerns around asking for certain sorts of adjustments are such, that there's a great deal of fear around doing that. And rather than ask for those, or rather than ask for different adjustments, or kind of when they're not working, ask for a reassessment, the person will just leave. Okay, so it's incredibly important that you can thrive as well as get the job, right? So really understanding what it is you need, again, we are there for that, right? So we will take into account exactly what, the work environment looks like. We can speak to your new employer on your behalf. Or indeed, if you've been in work for a little bit of time and you think, I think I do need an adjustment after all, then we can, again, speak to them at that point, which, by the way, as I think I've already mentioned, is fine. You can ask for an adjustment for whatever reason, at whatever time you choose. Change of circumstances, because you change your mind, whatever. So that is totally up to you. And at this point, because the law's really on your side, you should feel relatively comfortable providing them with the details that they ask for. So what kind of things are we talking about? Again, it might be a change to adjustment to hardware or software, some form of technology that's adapted to your needs. Meetings, so this is a little bit like interviews, but meetings in this case. So you can ask for there to be changes of format, length, timing, location, holding meetings in quieter areas, or attending virtually, for example. Again, support workers. So yes, in the context of an interview, but also in the context of work. So that may be somebody who comes in to assist with certain tasks or for a certain amount of time during the day. Again, support animals are becoming increasingly common if a situation permits. And of course, we have, assistance dogs and what have you, the more traditional animal assistants. But again, that can be adapted to the situation. And the adjustments of perception, the adjustments of attitude, which I've just mentioned, these also apply in the workplace, right? So this is about trying to get teammates, managers, whoever it is you're working with, ensuring that they don't come at your working relationship with any preconceptions and any misunderstandings. So behaviors may be different, they may just simply, feel awkward. They may have just a lack of understanding. And so training can be an incredibly powerful tool and is in itself to be treated as an adjustment. So that can be requested. So, we would suggest that you think about, what do you think people's expectations can be where they get this wrong, where they misunderstand, or, where they feel awkward, or where they don't think to ask you about certain things that you need to be asked about, whatever it is that kind of is something that you notice that you're impacted by in terms of people's attitude. Is it deadlines? Is it the way they, shift the goalposts around what's required on a project quickly without thinking how that might impact you? Whatever that is, you can communicate that to them either directly or via HR. And again, those things, they should be viewed as adjustments, because once they're viewed as adjustments and once they're termed as adjustments, then there's a requirement to provide them. Yeah. So changes to the physical environment, finally, again, making spaces more accessible. Now, we're probably not talking about wholesale kind of changes to the building with lifts installed and ramps in the case of most employers, although in the case of very, very large employers, that may be the case. But because it has to be reasonable, it has to be within their budgetary means. But again, they would be expected to come up with something to make that possible for you. So whether that was, you had to, if they can't change an environment, then that you would be able to work from home X amount of time or work in this kind of office, or, whatever that looks like. So it's up to them to kind of come up with that solution. So just ending on our golden words, which are privacy and choice. So we love privacy and choice, as well as our kind of little unapologetic mantra, privacy and choice. So this is your condition. Yeah. Therefore, whatever you choose to tell anybody or not tell anybody, and when you choose to do that, and in whichever method you choose to do that by, it's up to you. So we tell you what we think you should do. We can assist you in doing it. We think you're in your, best placed to succeed if you ask for what you need, but ultimately this is up to you, right? So you define what you consider private, and that is essentially the end of that. The law is on your side, and it's your friend. The Equality Act is your friend. And it's there to protect you, and we can help you access that protection and access those rights. So on that word, accessing, and somebody asked how they can access our service. So I think Mariella put it in the chat, but that's our website. And on our website, there's an area for registration, but I think there's also a little link on pretty much every page because we're deeply keen that everybody should be registering with us. And once you're registered, all our services are available to you completely free of charge. And you, as I said earlier, also you don't need a formal diagnosis of any sort. So once you have registered, there won't be any kind of automatic anything actually. What you need to then do is write to the info@ address, let us know that you have registered, and one of our adjustments team will be in touch with you very, very shortly. And then you can have a chat with them. Even, and I suggest you do this even if you don't think you need it yet. Even if you're like, oh, I'm a first year, I might need this in the first year, in the third year. Register, have a chat, start to get to know a member of the team and build up that relation, let them get to know you, because it's a, you know, it's a journey, it's an ongoing journey, and hopefully we'll be able to support you, you know, on an ongoing basis. So we don't just now support students and graduates, we also have a service we've expanded in recent years into experienced hires. So, you know, if this works, hopefully it can be a relationship that lasts, you know, throughout your career. So, you know, think of it like that. Think of it as establishing a relationship. Don't be shy. They're absolutely lovely. Just, you know, register, get in touch, and let's see how we can help you. Does anybody have any more questions?
Yeah, we've got two.
Okay.
So far. Do the employers not receive some government support funding to make certain adjustments?
They do. They receive access to work in certain circumstances. Actually, access to work isn't the employers receiving it, it's you receiving it. So you would have to make that application. And again, our adjustments team can talk to you, or I can talk to you a little bit more outside of this about the details of adjustments to work. But globally, yeah, the position legally is that it's for the employer to pay, for the most part. Yeah, so there are certain circumstances for adjustment to work, but globally, you know, it's the employer's responsibility. What it definitely isn't is yours. Yes, if they can't afford to provide the full adjustment, for example, then there might be some access to work support, but you know, what it never is your issue.
And then someone's asked, I wanted to ask, I've accepted a job offer, and after receiving my contract, I saw that the job has a condition of a 2-1 degree. I'm very unlikely to obtain that due to my various issues I've had with my condition. Is there something I can ask for an adjustment on?
Yeah, let's try it. I mean, it's a condition of the job, so it might not work. But there's no reason not to try that, yeah, as an adjustment. And register with us, reach out, and we can speak to you about that. So we had something a little bit like this recently. That was to do with professional qualification for a lawyer, but that person asked for something slightly similar. So as long as you can prove that the unlikelihood of reaching the 2-1 is specifically linked to your disability, then we can ask for that. And indeed we do. So our employer partners, we tend to say, you know, they often say 2-1 or first, yeah, as one of their screening criteria. And when we're doing audits with our partners, we strongly discourage that. So, you know, we say a lot of candidates who are fantastic candidates might not get those grades because of disability. So, you know, adjust it. Just in the case of disability, not for everybody else, just adjust it. And you know, depending on the employer, there can be flexibility around it. But again, I think you should let us help you with that, to try and get to put that in a way that's palatable. But yes, you can.
And then does the student graduate have to liaise with access to work themselves, or do through HR?
No, I think you have to do it yourself. I'm not an expert on access to work. My colleagues know a lot more about it because they deal with it day in, day out. But my understanding is if it's needed, the employer will expect you to do it. So I think it's down to the individual to do it. Again, and if you want to write detail, if you want to ask the question to me in more detail, send me an email and I can pass it on to my colleague who knows a lot more about this.
That's everything.
Yeah, that's everything. Okay. Fabulous. Well, thank you all so much. For those of you who haven't put in the feedback form which university you're attending from, please do. And again, thank you so much for your time. Anything that I didn't cover sufficiently, wasn't clear enough about, or any of the things I've said to you, please reach out to us for a bit more clarity. Because of course we're not, we're a relatively modest organisation, so we can't all know everything there is to know on each element of our business. So but we will have somebody who can help you with that. So please do reach out to us. Let us know. Mariella, can you also put my email in the the chat in case anybody wants to any of these further follow-up questions that I mentioned? And as I said, we'll be sending the recording to your careers services. So if you'd like to get a copy of that, you should reach out to them. I think it's fairly swiftly. I think is that right, Mariella? Did they receive it?
Yeah, it's been quite quick, and I'm just about to send the second one today.
Okay, so yeah. And again, if there's anything that you think of that we didn't cover or that you weren't comfortable talking about, please just reach out to one of us, and we will get back to you as soon as we can. So thank you again. I'm just going to